My uncle was a photographer, amateur photographer, and then moved into being a photojournalist. My father was an artist and a photographer. So I grew up with photography and art. But as I said, it was an unusual home because I grew up in a sort of Orthodox Muslim family. In other words, the Muslims are not supposed to be involved in art, making images of other people, graven images. They don't hang images, personal photographs, and artwork other than much more unusual was the fact that, yeah, you grow up with your father's room, which is also his studio, strewn with drawings and paintings. And my uncle's room was the same, photographs and magazines and you name it. I watched them processing using a bathroom in the backyard, converted into a dark room. So that's what I grew up with a lot of images. I finished my matric without passing. So now I was without a job. My father said, yeah, and gave me a book on woodcuts. I began learning on my own, carving, learning, reading the book. And one of the early woodcuts that I did was from a photograph that my uncle had taken of some of us kids sitting, playing a card game in the street. I was then encouraged by my dad and his friends to submit it to Art South Africa, which I did. The woodcut won a prize. So, now I'm an artist. Walking around town. I'm an artist. While I was doing this, also part of a group of young people who met regularly as a study group. My friend, Dumile, who had a big influence on me, when he came to Durban, he stayed with us. We had a lot of discussions. First, we had to sort him out because gallery had submitted his work to exhibitions, international exhibitions. And he said, hey, brother, you're a sellout. What the hell are you breaking the cultural boycott for? Mm-hmm. And so we had to, educate him politically. So we had these very, very intense discussions on art and politics, but also about how does one represent what was happening around us? That was the key issue. How does one represent it without it becoming township art, without it becoming one-dimensional? We were very critical of terms like township art, black art, all of that, and we were unpacking these things. I then become very involved in establishment of the trade union. I was working with the Black consciousness people, many of whom were slightly younger than me. When the unions grew and when the 73 strikes started, I then started working full-time in the union. So my artwork was kept aside. In the union, we began to start worker classes. Every evening after work, people would come to the office and we would have classes on politics, on trade unions and worker rights and things like that. So I thought to myself, why don't we use a slide tape presentation? Yeah, so I went and bought a camera and I started teaching myself. Also trying to use the camera to document some of the conditions in the factory. But most of those experiments or photographs I was taking didn't work because I should smuggle myself in at very early in the morning into some of the factories at 4 or 5 o'clock in the morning when there's a shift change. But I didn't get the exposures right. So I set up a dark room. I began taking pictures, lots of pictures of my wife and my daughter that was just born. Also at that stage, working with squatter communities. As part of a network, some of us were involved in places like Inanda with former Robben Island prisoners and political activists. We began working in those communities. Yeah, there were social conditions. They were horrific. There was no water. There was no, basic facilities. There was a huge drought, especially in 1980, 79, 80. And there was this problem of families and houses being demolished and people being forced to leave. At the same time, there were also the politics around all of housing, because there was Inkatha, and the Inkatha land warlords in that area were the ones who were now making an enormous amount of money in taking over land and putting shacks in and charging people rents. So I just, because I carried my camera, kept on taking photographs. And then realized that some of these photographs could be used for publicity around the issues facing people, of removals in that area. So my activism, my photographs, and the use that we've been made now to create consciousness to the broader community outside this Inanda now takes on, without me realizing, takes on a new sort of way of working. That you now think, oh, well, there's this issue. And it's an issue that has an impact on people, but nobody knows about it. I was faced with a community that trusted me, who knew me, and at the same time in that community was this very, very violent right-wing group in Qatar who were very unhappy. But you all the time had to look up over your shoulders. And sometimes, a couple of times, my shoulders and my head nearly was departed from each other. So it was a tough place, but you took pictures. And the way I took pictures was not for a photographic project. It was to use photographs for making people aware. The photographs were used in the campaign. And in fact, we were able to catch the attention of Parliament, especially with regard to the issue of the typhoid, the outbreak of typhoid and its impact. And nobody bothered about it until we made it an issue. It was how I was able to continue using the space that I was in to document, to rethink people and representation. Fatima Mir came to me and says, Omar, I want to do a book on children. I want you to take some pictures. So very ignorant about this. How does one put together a book? And so I put together photographs, and I and Fatima edited them, and she wrote the text. Her name doesn't appear on the book because she was banned. We had an exhibition and launched the book. The next day, the book was banned. So that was Letter to Farzana. And because it got banned, everybody took notice of it. And again, you must understand, this was done on a shoestring. The photographs, we did the layout together. I even worked with the printers, making the plates, printing, binding. I had some experience doing that, working in a printing press just after I left school. So I learned all these processes, learned how to start creating a narrative. It's just, you were thrown into the deep end. The only reference that you had, there were very few books done by anyone in our communities. While we were tinkering around with this book, we pre-sold the book in the community in Durban, especially in the Black community. What is important is that we were working and teaching it ourselves. All these skills of editing, putting together publication, distributing, there was no other way of doing this. All that debate about representation and creating a narrative. If you ask me, people ask me, which is your best book? And I would say Imi Jondolo, because for me that was where I broke certain new ground. And it had very small circulation. We were, as young activists, trained to read and discuss very critically literature. Well, we're all reading whatever we could get. We were looking at South African literature, and the drum and been very critical of the writers of the 50s and early 60s. And a lot of our ideas were being shaped by that reading. We were reading texts which we were able to smuggle into the country through networks that looked at what was happening in African literature in particular. We were reading some of the magazines like Black Orpheus and others. All this synergy and debate about, again, the type of art that we're producing, who were we producing art for? Who were we producing art for? We created our own libraries, actually, very, very good libraries, underground libraries, and distribution and reading and of books sharpened our understanding about the debate. The other thing is that we didn't see these areas as areas for advancement because there was no work. There were very few outlets for photographers. So you didn't think about photography as a way of making a living because there wasn't a way of selling your product. So they had no value in that sense. Unlike the market theater generation, they all wanted to make it big in New York. We were very conscious of our audience. And we were able to set up our own galleries. We didn't call them pop-up galleries, we just called them galleries. There were shops in the Indian area that were empty, and we would then take it over. The landlords would allow us without charging us. And so they were very sympathetic to some of us, and they allowed us these spaces. So we put up our own exhibitions in our own community. We also had this other thing that we had to train other artists and photographers. So it was a natural thing for us to take people under your wing. They would ask questions. When you're putting an exhibition together, then they would be there and they would ask questions. If you look at the contact sheet, why did you choose that? And so your understanding becomes sharper when you have people next to you that you are teaching or having a dialogue with. So whether we were photographers or poets or playwrights, in that particular period and subsequently, it was a time of now a revival. It's now a new audience emerging. We didn't see ourselves as big shots in New York. And yeah, we were just doing what we were doing, enjoying what we were doing, not making any money out of what we were doing, but just managing. We must understand the context. In the 60s and 70s, especially in the 70s and 80s, we were in a special moment in South African history, a world history, where people are struggling for freedom. The struggle had sharpened. There were thousands of new people who are now drawn into this struggle. It takes on national and international character. So it's a special moment. Yeah. That doesn't happen every day in most societies, where there is a revolution to take place, where there's new innovative ideas and there's a cry for freedom. Our goal was our revolution. And in that process, people then looked at art differently. Because when I started, people will say, hey, how are you going to make a living? So it wasn't a cool thing hanging out with these artists. So you didn't have aspirations for being a professional artist, exhibiting all over the world. Nothing like that. You just had a life and death struggle that was emerging, and you use your art, you use yourself if you were a poet or an actor on a stage, and an artist to put up your work wherever you could find a space. There was no one mediating between you and the final product other than your community. of activists and people generally. And that's how the idea of Afropic started, to train young people, to create our own agency and our own distribution network internationally, so that the international community would understand what was happening. And we were able to feed now a new constituency that was the community newspapers, church newspapers, political organizing, trade union newspapers. It was limited, but we were able to feed those. But more important, we were able to feed the anti-apartheid movement outside the country, the international press. And if you go onto our website, you will see we've created a chronology of exhibitions, photographic exhibitions in the country, from the late 50s to 1990s. And you will see how many exhibitions were being held, how many books were being produced, and who were producing them, and for what purpose. It's a very interesting analysis. We must understand that when we look at this, it is a very special moment in a country's life, because revolutions don't happen every day. Mass struggles don't happen every day. And a fight against a very powerful enemy doesn't happen every day. How does one use your skills for the greater good, but at the same time grow personally? The other big project that I was involved in was the Carnegie Project, where we were able to bring all together so many photographers from around the country. Photo gallery, the photo workshop was a turning point, and the bridge between the two generations. Very interesting bridge. But they were churning out photographers. Very few of them were able to find the space and the resources that Santu had, and the patronage that Santu had, to be able to go and do a project. And now with photography, there's such a revolutionary change. Everyone now is a photographer with a camera. In the era of the digital, the way one uses that new technology. So you could take a picture, you could add word, you can add moving images, and you can send it out. One has to be very careful that one doesn't begin to prescribe what people should do. One has to have an open dialogue, be robust in that dialogue, but not close spaces for people. But now we faced a crisis. In this crisis, what do we do? How do we go about dealing with and representing the incredible hurt, the incredible injustices that people are undergoing? The audience overnight has changed and have now new experiences. That's a revolution in itself, at a pace that is quite phenomenal.
Radical.
One incident has started a revolution. When the cop has his knee on Floyd's neck, people were taking pictures, recording it. And that picture, that video now became such a powerful revolutionary vehicle that it ignited an international movement. So remember that we have our own government now. We might not like it, but if you are now asked to come up with a set of recommendations to stimulate the art, to use the art to send out certain messages, to be able to come up with a very clear set of proposals to fight around and say to your government, we want this so that we could produce X, Y, and Z, without becoming propagandists. We mustn't say to them that you are oppressed. You are now the instrument of your own destiny, that you have agency as an artist. And as an artist, your agency and your work doesn't stop on the piece of paper that you're working on. You can actually make a difference by promoting, moving, and lobbying government. Otherwise, all you have is this bloody thing about neocolonialism and black like me or white like me. It's a very narrow debate. How do we reach out to them? How do we build that community of people again? If you look at the Abashlali Amalo group, they are producing, and they will be producing a lot of young people from those communities that are attuned to using media to make people aware of their conditions and how they've used their little resources to make themselves accessible. Don't feel hopeless, because those people are doing it not for a market. They're doing it because it's life and death for them.